Bonjour.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is always great to meet the audience of REAix that grows more numerous one year after the other. I'm Sophie Vess. I'm in charge of transport with the newspaper Le Monde. We're here to talk about the new challenges of mobility. As you know, this sector has a peculiarity. It represents 30% of the carbon emissions, and it's the only sector where we cannot get the emissions to drop, even though we have been trying for a while. So we have an hour with the best experts to find a solution that Hippolyte Dalbis will summarize at the end. So let's get started. To talk about the topic, we will be with the Minister of Transport, Mr. Clément Beaune, with Anne-Marie Drac, who was also Minister of Transport, but also of Foreign Trade, and President of the RATP, the subway company in Paris. And I think, Anne-Marie, you're also a board member with Air France KLM, and Total Energy as well. So we will also be with Yann REAix. Yann REAix is the General Director of Getlink. You may not know Getlink, but if I give you the old name, Eurotunnel, you understand immediately what we're talking about. And then Thierry Direz, who's the CEO of Covéa, you know the MAF, the GMF, MMA, they're all insurance companies. He is the first car insurer in France today, so he knows exactly what's going on in cars and roads, etc. So to start the conversation, I will give the floor to Hippolyte Dalbis, who's a member of the Cercle des Économistes, who prepared this roundtable. And I would like to take this opportunity to tell you that he wrote an excellent book that he coordinated with Françoise Benamou, who's president of the Circle, the Economist Talk to the Populist. Hippolyte, it's a great book. Hippolyte, you have the floor. Thank you, Sophie. I'm just here to give you a few elements of what we're going to be talking about. I will start by saying that mobility is what we do every day. That's according to the Statistics Institute in France. They do 200 million daily commutes per day. That means that everybody does 3 journeys every day as part of their commute. So if we're going to do policies on mobility, we should allocate every day. We're going to impact every day the behavior of people. Mobility is a source of tensions, sometimes source of frustrations because of traffic, but heavy traffic. But we have experienced it when we were deprived of this mobility. We perceived it as a very strong deprivation of freedom. So the catchword, going to work every day in the subway and going back home is part of our everyday life. So Sophie said it. We often know that it's a sector that is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, that is also responsible for impacting the environment. I think we should take the situation the other way around. Instead of seeing some problems, we should see it as opportunities to decarbonate and reduce the human footprint on the environment. What is very interesting with the mobility sector is the 3 fields of human intervention for decarbonation are here. The first one is the law and the standard. We can pass some laws to reduce mobilities, for example, forbid plane travel on short distances when there's an option to use train, etc. So it's not always easy, but it's one of the possibilities. The other option is to to have some economic incentives with prices. For example, some have bad press. We heard about that. We remember the carbon tax that stopped in 2018, the TIPP, floating TIPP. It's a French measure. Or we can also play with prices, having lower prices typically to encourage people to use transport that are less polluting. And the third option, these are not necessarily competing against each other. The third option is the technology change, the innovation, and this is also an option, but that requires a lot of energy and a lot of financing. Last point, since it's everyday's life of people, it's not just a matter of experts or engineers. It's a political issue. We remember the yellow vests, which was the revolt in France of those who have a car and drive a car. Last year we saw exactly a similar situation, except that it was a protest of those who don't have a car. And we could see the reaction to law enforcement agency was to stop all the circulation of public transports. So the fact that it's political does not mean that it's complicated, but it means that it's fascinating. So I'm looking forward to have the 4 members of the panel today to discuss this with us in REAix. Thank you, Hippolyte. Clément Beaune, you have the floor first. I hadn't made the link between the yellow vests, those who have a car, and those who don't own a car. Maybe you can say something about this. You can answer this comment, and then we can try to identify our roadmap to decarbonate the sector. Thank you very much. Of course, what Hippolyte said sums up very well the situation. I've been discovering this for a year now. When you're Minister of Transport, you have the drama you have the privilege of dealing with the drama of everyday life's situation, and you have to you are in charge of a public policy that affects people at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, depending on people's commute. In all crises, there's a subject of mobility of transport because it is integrated in our everyday life. This having said, all the people in the country are waiting for policy to transform mobility and transport. And the first change is going to be decarbonation. You gave a key number when you talk about decarbonation, collective decarbonation, to be neutral, carbon neutral in 2050. The carbon emissions represent 30% of transport today. And it could be 30% of the problem or 30% of the solution. From a public policy point of view, and I believe we'll get back to this, we can't really debate it for too long because the applications are simple. We need to activate all the possible levers at the same time. When you have a sector that represents 30% of the emissions, 30% of the energy bill, that touches everything, impacts everyone, and the only one that hasn't dropped its emissions since 1990, you have to activate all possible levers at once. That doesn't mean that you have to press all the notes at the same time, hoping that the music will come out well. You have to be consistent between all the buttons that you're going to press at the same time. So there's some what we call brown uses to green uses. We need to decarbonate modes of transport that are the most. We're not going to go from road to rail, but rail to plane. We're going to decarbonate all the modes of transport in themselves. It is not inconsistent to support electric car massively and at the same time to encourage people to take the train. We have to fight on both fronts, because if you have a lot of travels that are being done by road, if you don't decarbonate the rail, you don't do the full job of decarbonation. So when I say we don't need to press on all the buttons at the same time, I'm going to give you a precise example. I see Augustin Romanet, who's another representative of the airway sector. So if we want to decarbonate the sector and be relevant on such and such measure, but it means that sometimes we're going to tax, sometimes we will move from one mode of transport to another. That was the famous decree of 2 hours 30 that entailed closing a number of air routes. But I also fought so we can have public means of subsidies for R&D to decarbonate this industry that is capital for the country. We're not going to suppress the plane. We're going to decarbonate the airplane before we suppress it. So that means that we need to encourage our industry. We have a sovereign industry, particularly in the aeronautic sector. So we have to invest in sustainable fuel, in engines that are less polluting, in all the decarbonation strategies. So we need to talk about the modal report. We need to change all sectors with innovation in industry. The only challenge that remains is in these levers of action, where do we insist on frugality? My deep conviction is we're not going to tell people is that decarbonation means less mobility, because it's a human need to move. We haven't waited for so long to feel the need to move around. It's an essential need, but we have to look at usage, some frugality measures, incentives, etc. We can't say that some sectors are different than others. There's some sectors we want to reduce the footprint of the activity. In terms of mobility, we don't want to do this. We don't want to tell people, you are going to move less, and every time we're going to find solutions. And if people feel that we're just blocking them, the whole debate on the carbon tax showed it, we have a big problem. So we should not give up on those tools. We just need to help them be better. Among the various public policies that we have, I believe that we have a few cultural changes to do. We talked about it a lot with Anne-Marie REAix. We have a French policy that is very focused on infrastructure. And of course, we need quality infrastructures. That's what we do by having some charging stations throughout the highway grid. But if we don't think about the usage, and if we don't think about the intermodality, we'll miss out on a number of fronts. Let me take the example of the car. We need to have electrical cars. But on the very short term, before we have a full fleet of cars that is electrified and public system, add additional public transport, which takes a long time, we will need to think about carpooling. It's not instead of, or it's a fundamental measure that needs to be implemented. It's the same with intermodality. So sometimes you feel that you want to be completely carbonated, you take the car to do everything. But if you want to decarbonate, you take the train. But if you decarbonate only 10 kilometers out of 50, it's already a good step. It's already a good effort. Or if you take your own car to go to a place where you have an access to urban transport that works well, it's already a good start. So I think it applies to the state, to the local authorities. We need to think more instead of usage and intermodality. Anne-Marie REAix, what Clément Beaune is saying is difficult not to agree with it, but it's difficult to do it. So can you explain to us what are the blocking points between the needs and the duties of the citizens? You are already president of France Logistics, so there's a whole discussion and a whole thought on mobility of people and goods that matter in the equation. I will start with building on what said the Minister of Mobilities. The big challenge is to combine our duty to decarbonate, so the 30%, 1/3 of goods and 2/3 of people, with the right to mobility. The right to mobility is part of the law that your predecessor passed, who is now a prime minister. It has to do with equality, freedom, it has to do with society. So very often when we talk about new mobilities, we forget that not everyone can work from home. And not everyone has the luxury to live in a big urban area where they have big offers for mobility, from scooters to subway, etc. Regarding goods, it's not really a right, but it's a need, rather. A need to feed people, a need to supply stores. So also construction, public works, waste management, then agriculture as well, the food industry, the food sector, and various goods linked to distribution, imported or not, and among those, on the distribution side, there's the e-commerce that, whether it's B2B or B2C in France, represent about 14%. And I'm not talking about a ton per kilometers, but I'm talking about values in terms of profit, turnover. So we can see that goods cannot move around by themselves. They need to be transported. We talked about it with the Prime Minister and Clément, and it's true that more circular economy and more industries located on our territory could lead to more logistics movement. I would like to add a lever. You both talked about many things. There's a lever, an organizational lever, and a lever to be more focused. Let me take an example. For the people who use the Metropolitan Express that are going to be put in place, I feel, and Mr. President of the SNCF, if you want to transport at the same time 300 people, subway, train, it work. If we want to transport dozens of them, this is more a matter of buses, coaches, express bus, which are implemented by some local authorities. If we want to transport 3 people, we are looking more at carpooling situation, and there's a number of companies, I'm thinking about Ecomove, they propose carpooling integrated in the public offer of public transportation. At some points, some periods where it would be better to move smaller number of people at the same time, at a time. So the logistics works for 200 kilos at 10 kilometers. Trains, it's great, in 100 tons. Trucks, and over hundreds of kilometers. And they don't drive right into the restaurant or next to the restaurant or next to the hospital. Trucks are measured in tons and for all distances. So I think that we need to target this way. For logistics, I would like to offer 3 different types of levers. The first one is the massification. I talked about in terms of vehicles, but it could also be grouping some orders, for example, wondering if you want to have everything on time is always relevant, organizing the shipment more smartly over time. So it's my first M, massification / mutualization. The second lever, you know how important it is at the moment, is the question of meshing. You're going to be surprised by the word meshing. I'm talking about the meshing of infrastructures, all the works that are being conducted by SNCF REAix, but also I would like to talk about the meshing of stations, which is storage. It's not great for the carbon footprint when a person who lives in the southwest of France has something delivered from Spain, for example. The trend right now to move away the storage space further and further away from the urban centers is not very smart either. So when we think about how we're going to organize things, the second M for meshing, is very important. We're looking at different levers. We're looking at urban planning at the local, regional stage level. And the third M, which is motors, engines, you've already talked about it. And I would like to say that regarding trucks of various sizes, we are at the very beginning of the story. Right now, we build less than 1,000 electrical trucks per year, all sizes. The registration for year represents 50,000. So it's a start. With the minister and his colleague, we worked a lot on the roadmap, the national strategy, low carbon strategy. Apparently, everybody tells us that we need to start. Today, we're still at 90% diesel. So it's going to be a long way to go. And I would like to tease you and tease some of my friends here. I think what matters is the journey, because no matter what we do, we will all get mobilized for modal transfer. we will remain at 70–80% road transport for goods, and for people, maybe when the Greater Paris will be implemented, when we'll have a lot of offers and call for tenders, will still be at 2/3 of cars. So everything that you're doing and that the government is doing to promote decarbonation of vehicles, it's going in the right way. And the global vision of all these challenges that are going to take a lot of time. It's the same thing then for the sustainable air fuel. It's going to take a long time and a lot of money. And it's good to have a shared hope, and we do have it. Thank you, Anne-Marie REAix. Jan REAix, maybe you can tell us in a few words what Getlink does beyond going under the channel. You have a whole logistics activity business, and this year you decided to present your results in an interesting way by presenting not only the financial results, but your decarbonated margin, by integrating the price of fuel as if we were paying it the full price. So you kept the price determined by American fintech, which is a very high price, and you still have a positive result. But if all companies did it the same, they would surely look differently, and it could be probably a trigger to decarbonate quicker the transport sector. Yes, Getlink is the group Eurotunnel that I don't present. We also have some freight trains in France and the Netherlands and Belgium, and a lot of transport between France and Great Britain. I would like to take a step back on these questions of decarbonation and mobility to understand what are the challenges, and to remind that we've been trying to decarbonate for many years and we don't succeed. We've been fighting for 40 years from the urban massification. We've been trying to organize a massive modal transport towards public transport, and we haven't succeeded either. We have been trying to reduce CO2 emissions emitted by cars for 40 years. If each car emits less today than it did before, the CO2 emissions still are increasing because we drive more. And we've been trying to organize carpooling for a while. After the war, when everybody wanted to have their car, we're at 2 to 3 person per car. We're only at 1.5. So it's a lot of years where we are less and less people per car. So we measure well why the question is very difficult to answer. The mobility sector is the only one sector that hasn't been decarbonated since 1990. And since then, we have taken some very strong commitments with the Paris Agreement. We should take it a step further and to do it successfully. Why didn't we succeed? I think that's the question that we need to ask ourselves today. And the main reason is because mobility is more than transport. Mobility is transport, but it's also a question of where you live and where you work. It's a question of where you go to relax, where you shop. And if I feel that it's going to take me too long to go to work, of course, I can go from walking to driving, but I decide to move closer, or to work from home, to get a different job, a job that is closer to where I live. So it encompasses a lot of different realities. We talk about transport, we talk about urban planning, housing, and all these policies in France belong to different authorities. We have a Minister of Transport today. Even if he's brilliant, he doesn't choose the speed that people drive in the urban areas. And that limits us because it prevents us from having a holistic vision and to treat mobility as a whole, the everyday mobility and the residential mobility. At this stage, we could be pessimistic and think that we can't do it, it's mission impossible. But such as Tom Cruise, who releases his next movie next week, I believe that there's a way and we can do it if we manage to put in place 3 key conditions. The first one is to address this different layers of administration. We have to address mobility with prices, to give a rate per carbon that is the same everywhere in France and maybe in Europe for all the different modes of transport, for which will give visibility over time. So it's based on the logic of the polluter payer, but the not so good news is that we don't give visibility on the cost of carbon. Concretely, a household that decides to move further away from the center and to drive into the center of the city does it on the basis that its mobility is not going to, the cost of the mobility is not going to grow over time. If you give them mobility over a long period of time, maybe they'll choose to move outside of the city, but close to a train line or closer to the city. So that's the first topic. Give people some visibility on the cost of carbon. Second element, if we use this logic of polluter payer, the carbon is going to become, you're going to have to pay for carbon. We're a listed company. We are submitted to some regulations where we have to publish our financial statements. We have to publish a lot of extra financial indicators, particularly with all the new directives that are being issued. But we never make a link between financial and extra financial. In the way we rate carbon, it's the same situation. So we're the first one to publish our decarbonated margin. So we calculate our traditional margin for the financial expert in the room. We understand how it's done. And then we add to the traditional classical margin a bill that is for now only virtual that corresponds to what we should be paying if carbon was to be paid for. So we calculate our ton of CO2 emitted on the 3 scopes. We multiply it by a price per ton. We chose 97 euros and we see the result. So when we do this calculation, if we realize that our margin, our positive margin, brings us down to a negative decarbonated margin, that would mean that our business is not sustainable over time, and that we have a real issue or a real business model, or we have to make a deep transformation of our operation modes or infrastructures to manage to go beyond this decarbonation stage. With Getlink, our activities are mostly green, and our decarbonated margin is only 3% less than the classical margin. So we're a very well-positioned actor.
Alors c'est celui qui a vu.
The third point is the one that Clement mentioned earlier, which I think is important to repeat, is the one about infrastructure. Local authorities have an important role to play there. To have clean transport, you have to have the appropriate infrastructure, whether it's cycle tracks or a rail network that allows this in transport businesses for goods and for passengers. We are not, in 4% of cases, we're not able to satisfy the contracts we've signed with customers because of network problems. So to transport goods on a train from point A to point B, in 4 times out of 100, we're not on time because we have a network problem which requires massive investment, and we know we're lagging behind in that area. So those are 3 points. So a price signal, carbon tariffication that is more visible. This is missing. We have to go to make sure we have the right indicators, and we have to have a green infrastructure. So 3 points. Thank you, Thierry Gardez. Thierry Gardez. You work with cyclists, amongst other things. How do you evaluate our use of cars, which represents 80% of mobility and journeys? How do you see this use in the future of the car? I don't pretend I have a crystal ball and know what's going to happen. It might be very disappointing for everybody and deceptive, especially for my friends on the panel. As you've been kind enough to introduce myself as a major car insurer, let me give you some information about quantities and explain why, in my opinion, they are important in relation to the question we're talking about today. Today represents 3/4 of journeys that are carried out using cars. The average French car is a diesel, 11 years old, and only one person uses it. That's the photograph of the average car user. In the future, it might be useful to look at the younger people. Their behavior is slightly different. If you look at the population of a very urban area, let's say the Paris urban area, or if we compare that with rural areas. In the Paris urban area, less than 41% of young people aged between 18 and 26 have a driving license. It's 85% of the same age group, 18 to 26, in rural areas. So that's one indicator about the frequency of use of cars. And the trends in the difference is increasing. 7 or 8 years ago, the difference was not as great. It was 7 points less between urban areas and rural areas. One of the questions is about the trajectory, to use a rather simplified term, that we've experienced over the last few years, which doesn't really illustrate, in rural areas in particular, a real reduction in use of cars. The other indicator about use of cars is that sales of new cars represent less than 3 times the sales of used vehicles. Less than 3 times. If we look at all of the transactions for cars, including businesses and fleets. But if we focus on private individuals, the differences is from 1 to 7. For one car that is a subject of a commercial transaction that is new, there are 7 that are the subject to a commercial transaction and which are used cars. So 7 times as many. So this shows how contrasted the landscape is. The minister said earlier that we needed to use all of the different levers. Of course, that's true. But I think, first of all, we have to know them and observe them so we don't offer solutions which are too deceptive for our citizens. Let's be careful about generalizing too much. Let's be careful to not be too impersonal. This can mean that we're not meeting the needs of people who need to use a car. And finally, there's one word that hasn't been used about cars, is freedom. Cars are very successful because they are a wonderful tool allowing free people to have freedom. I'm not saying we should be enchanted by this freedom or just only use cars and nothing else. What I'm saying is if we don't look at that dimension of the use of cars, we will not see a part of the problem and therefore a part of the solution. No doubt, a car is the machine, is the manufactured object that has the most structural impact on our existence through the travel we do and the way our society is organized. All of this has been determined by cars. It's less true now, but this historical aspect is something we've taken on board and we must ignore it, not ignore it when we're looking for solutions. Thank you very much. This is an interesting moment because this roundtable is taking place at a time where the government is carrying out a strategic planning to decarbonize with a lot of discussion, and apparently the Prime Minister is very demanding and often says to people, this is not correct, you haven't looked at all the different arguments and possibilities. Perhaps Clement Beaune, you could tell us where you've got to in this strategic planning, and can you tell us whether you are looking at the freedom that cars give people. Perhaps we need lighter cars. Perhaps how far are you going in your ecological strategic planning to take account of all of these different constraints? And if you're looking at freedom, you have to accept certain constraints on freedom. I believe that Anne-Marie REAix, you're also participating in this work. Perhaps you could also explain how that is going. Thank you. I can confirm that it is a difficult and demanding piece of work. It's probably the first time we've done it in such a systematic way, sector by sector. Of course, I'm in charge of transport specifically, but I've participated in several meetings, and if you include in the mechanism so many different hypotheses, this means that you have to take a number of risks. For example, I'm looking at the transport sector. If you're saying we have to use a modal transfer and in the urban areas you want to develop active mobility solutions such as bicycles, if you want to reduce the number of daily journeys every day, this means that by 2030 people will work from home at a particular time with a particular frequency. In fact, we don't really know that's going to be the case. We know even that for transformations which according to the figures are quite small, if we take the example in the rail sector, if we want to double the proportion of rail, if we were to double the amount of rail for goods and for passengers, this would leave the road in the different types of use with other trucks and cars. Roads would still be very much in the majority. You get the impression when you double rail, it's a lot, but in fact it's not really very ambitious. We could still have a car that is still going to represent 80% of our use for travel in 2030 or 2040. It's still massive. That's why I'm saying that we have to look at the uses. If you only, in inverted commas, because this is still, even that is quite a considerable investment for the government and local authorities, if you invest in infrastructure, you don't have a very clear idea of how it's going to be used. We know, for example, that for public transport, their attractiveness is determined by the infrastructure, its availability and the proximity and accessibility, a whole series of criteria. You know that in international metropolises, and the issue of security is very important. If you're a woman, if the infrastructure, even if it's clean and bright, if it's not safe, people won't use it, especially if you're a woman alone. So we have to look at these cognitive aspects in our public discussions sometimes. Christophe Fenochet and other people have been in debates with me and talking about the prices of trains for people to buy tickets for trains. If we're perfectly honest, our effort in the area of public policy has to be in investment of rail. What I'm saying is that this planning process is done in a very systematic, rigorous way, and this is why we need to use as many levers as possible and in an organized way. The idea is to have something that is ordered and scientific and to have quantification and planning. But in the transport sector, to look at the most important sector because it has the most to do and it represents 30% of transport, we won't be able to do that. The decarbonization of air transport, road transport and modal transfer. The truth is that if we do as much as we can, we have a chance, as you said, if you're looking at the glass half empty or half full, we will be able to do maximum decarbonization of the transport sector. We don't know where that will be in 2030. We just know what we have to do, the different phases we have to get through by 2030. We know that if we want to achieve and stay on our trajectory that has been planned at the European level, so by 2050 we'll have carbon neutrality. It's about 35 million tons of CO2 that has to be economized in the transport sector. That has never been done, nothing like it. So how do you actually work? What is your working method? Do you work with the different players? These are administrations working just amongst themselves. Let me take an example. In the climate resilience law, which was voted before I took on the responsibilities as Minister of Transport, there were roadmaps that were people called Article 301. In Article 301, you have a decarbonisation roadmap for each sector. Maybe people here have participated in this. It's true for goods and for passenger transport, and it's true for each sector, air, road, rail, etc. So we asked each of the economic players, using the approach that my two neighbours have mentioned, We asked them what they thought would be the technology available and the cost of use and the cost trajectory for decarbonization of transport use in the future. Let me take the example of goods. Good transport. And here the hypotheses are changing very quickly. Before COVID, looking at working from home, we didn't think it was going to be such a massive type of behavior by 2030. Is it going to continue up to 2030 or not? We don't know. For goods transport by rail, we thought, no, good transport by road, we thought the cleanest technology would be natural gas. Today, we know, although there are only small production units, probably we're more capable than we thought 3 or 4 or 5 years ago to use electrification instead of natural gas. So it's in the really at the teething stages. We're very much at the beginning of what we're doing. But we know that even for a 44-ton truck, we're able to produce it in an electric version. This was unthinkable 3 years ago. We were talking about air transport earlier. The sustainable air fuels, we brought together a lot of players in the sector. Before the Paris Air Show with the President of the Republic, you can remember 5 years ago, nobody was talking about sustainable air fuel. There's a kind of imaginary solution. Today we have a roadmap for the transport sector where all of the actors are saying it's going to represent 40 to 50% of the decarbonization target between now and 2050. This justifies the rules. We have it's necessary to decarbonize at a European level. We didn't imagine this was going to be a priority 4 or 5 years ago. What I'm saying is that we have to do this planning work, but it will change and be modified as time goes by. And we know we're able to quantify the steps we have to take, but we know if we want to walk up those stairs, march step by step, we're going to have to put a lot of money in different sectors at the same time with visibility and another point about visibility. I'm not an economist. I agree with what REAix said. There's one point where we have to be very humble and modest, which is the visibility in terms of the investment trajectories and public subsidy trajectories in terms of the carbon price for a reasonable economic price. I think intuitively it's not going to be more than 10 years. And if we want to really give an industrial and economic trajectory, you have to look up to at least 2050. So how credible is it to give an economic symbol? You have to have this balance between defining the signals and admit there has to be some fragility. For sustainable air fuel, this has been defined. There will be a market price that has been defined. This will seem vital for the initial investment in that solution. I don't think anybody here is capable of saying whether we will have the same price in 10 years or 5 years' time, depending on the environmental or other types of developments, and whether it might be a different technology. Will sustainable air fuel suddenly become much, much cheaper? We don't know. That's why it's so difficult. We're living in a world of uncertainties that we have to deal with. It's not saying we're powerless. What I'm saying is we have to be aware of all of these many multifaceted aspects and of all these different tools and levers we can use. Anne-Marie Edouard, this planning method, do you think it brings together the companies and civil society effectively and the NGOs? I'd like to talk about my experience of what we call the National Low Carbon Strategic Planning for road transport. I can tell you about that. For goods and for passengers, I felt that it was a very good method indeed, an excellent method, because we had the energy experts, the energy producers who say they can produce organic or not, organic fuels or not. Then we had electricity. They said it'll be enough for everybody. And then they said, oh, it depends if we use hydrogen, we need more green hydrogen, etc. That was the energy people. Then we have the manufacturers, the builders, with one subject which is important there, which is to say that it's not always a buy Chinese act. So they have to be included as well. And so then we have the users with all of the difficulties in adjusting. We don't really know how much electricity is going to cost. We don't know how it will be taxed one day or another. And we don't know how there'll be an allocation of different types of fuels that people will want to use, particularly in the organic fuels. So we have to be very modest, and I think politically I think it must be very difficult for the minister, but he's succeeding for the time being. It's difficult to accept a good balance between this trying out and trial and error, because it's not true that we will have translated everything to rail and to electric cars and to cargo bicycles between now and 2030. That's not going to happen. At the same time, we have to build up the hope and the momentum and the capacity for investment of the different players. There will be public money invested and a lot of private money as well. So it's an excellent method, I think. The political methodology concerning the deadlines, because often it's a question of deadlines. When will this happen? That's what people want to know. This is very complicated, and that's why the actual idea of planning, I think, is an excellent idea. It's not just 22 pieces of work run by different civil servants. It also means everybody has the capacity to define their investment capacities and their decisions to invest in the different spaces. We're talking about urban planning and the locations of warehouses and the role of local authorities, and over a period of time also, and also these aspects of planning, which is important in all of our activities, which is the question of competencies and human skills, because most of the transport occupations are under pressure, because a lot of them will be completely transformed. Of course, this is the case in the car industry, with the, of course, electric vehicles are not the same as a combustion engine, of course. There still won't be the same sort of job. And in other professions as well, there are more and more service professions and more sophisticated professions involving artificial intelligence, forecasting traffic, and using software to secure customer loyalty. So in planning, we have to take account that aspect as well, which we are doing with the Minister and the Prime Minister. Yann REAix, concerning your approach to decarbonisation, have you been followed? Have people been inspired by you? Have you had reactions to what you've done? Could be a useful planning tool, do you think? Very recently, we've communicated for this time with the decarbonised margin. We will be doing this again. We had an expected amount of feedback. We had a huge number of demands which we weren't expecting. We're not able to respond to all of them. We're not here. We're here to resolve our own strategic issues, but the aim is not to evangelize. And on these subjects, we can see we're right at the beginning. There are a lot of other profound questions where we need to make progress, including from a theoretical point of view. For example, we talk a lot about investment. When there's money, people are expecting a return on their investment. And the government also is raising questions about its profitability. It's not really the same sort of investment as a normal financial investment, but the question has to be asked. Today, I think we no longer know what is the cost of capital in a decarbonizing world. All of the financial theories, according to which we work today with the different portfolios. I'm sorry to use the jargon, but we are working in the MEDAF, the model for evaluation of financial models. This model is designed for a world where there is money invested in several companies and several financial assets, and we raise a question of whether this capital is correctly allocated to get the best possible ROI. We have a source of money going to several types of investment. The world has changed now. Today, we no longer have one source of money. We have several sources of money. To simplify, I would say we have two. We're on one pouch of money which will be invested in green activities, another amount of money which doesn't care less and just looks at the yield and efficiency and could invest in green or brown activities. So the model we use for evaluation of these financial investments no longer works. And so we're no longer able to assess these things properly. And so apart from the fact we don't have a visibility about the cost of carbon, we don't know how much this is going to cost. This is a difficult question, but in other areas there are central banks who are able to look at an objective of 2% inflation of carbon price. If you have that, that's better than nothing. And on the other hand, if we look at the purely financial part of return on investment, we have to change our software, otherwise we're not going to arbitrate correctly. What we were saying earlier, that it's going to be difficult because it will be very costly. We've already seen that with the yellow jackets, that it hasn't been easy. if we also don't do it properly because we're not measuring and calculating properly, it's going to cost even more money than it would have cost otherwise. So otherwise we won't do it at all, or it will be complete rejection by our societies, and so our societies will be completely paralyzed. President Macron, in his program, promised that there would be electric vehicles available to households for 100 euros per month. We can see it's rather complicated to implement this scheme. There is a transport and environment think tank. There's an NGO and a think tank, and Transport and Environment and Lidri, who are proposing a solution, saying that you could have car manufacturers making a small light car with few options, which would be much cheaper than the vehicles being sold today. And in general, the question is being raised of having lighter vehicles generally. I'd like to know, as an insurer, Thierry REAix, do you think tomorrow's vehicles will be lighter, less robust, more dangerous? What do you think? Here again, I can't really see it. I'm sorry in front of such a distinguished audience to appear so weak in terms of my vision, but it's true. The subject for insurance is not first and foremost the vehicle. The subject, most important subject for insurers are the accidents linked to the vehicles. So, to answer, I don't know whether it answers your question, if vehicles are smaller, lighter, less robust, etc., we can fear there will be more injuries to users. When we have to think about that aspect. However, we can consider a prospect where the damage to the cars themselves will be less. The cars won't be so expensive and the repair costs will be lower. I don't have a precise answer on that subject. What I can say is that, unlike what you might think intuitively, electric vehicles have an average repair cost that is higher than combustion engine vehicles. Particularly, this is not what people think, no. But in fact, insurance makes it possible to call into question what people think. Or what the manufacturers say as well. No. That's what Tesla says. I haven't said anything about the manufacturers. I'll say something afterwards about that. Why are electric vehicles more expensive to repair? In the event of a fire, for example, in a combustion engine vehicle, normally most of the parts, I'm not talking about a complete fire of a whole vehicle, but a fire, you can recover some parts. In an electric vehicle, you won't get any of the parts. None of the parts will survive. So I'm sorry to look at these rather concrete aspects, but you don't have the same situation for these two different types of vehicle. I can't give an exact answer, but for electric vehicles, the studies that have been carried out don't show a reduction in the cost of repairs. Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our round table now. I'm trying to see. I don't think we have any time left for questions. We have 2 minutes. Perhaps one question? No, not even one question. No questions at all. Perhaps the speakers will be able to remain available after the session. There were a lot of questions online about autonomous vehicles and future RER systems in the metropolis here locally. We could have carried on for further. I'll let you finish. Hippolyte, have we found the solution? Yes. Well, the solution in 1 minute is not easy. It's a kind of form of pragmatism. We have to use all of the different levers. We have to also mobilize organizational dimensions and financial dimensions and insurance dimensions. Did you want to ask a question? We can't answer any questions, and we don't have time. Thank you for being attentive. It's quite impressive. Thank you.